Welcome back. Today we're going to look at whether the seemingly invincible Spartans are invincible to the biggest threat in the Halo universe, the Flood. So, what's the deal? Can Spartans be infected by the Flood? Well, it depends on which classification of Spartan we're talking about, and a number of other factors too, because each classification of Spartan sort of has a varying level of resistance against them. The most popular example of a Spartan appearing to be immune to the Flood is Sergeant Johnson. Now, for those who maybe aren't too well versed in Halo lore, Sergeant Johnson was part of a highly classified project called the Orion Project, which essentially acted as a prototype for the Spartan Project, thus rendering Sergeant Johnson unofficially as a Spartan I. The significant biological augmentations that Orion candidates went under during the project altered their muscle, their brain, their retina, and skewed their genetic mapping, making them seemingly different on a neurological level to other humans. To keep the program hidden, only masked these severe changes by creating a fake disease later known as Boren syndrome, and because Sergeant Johnson was a Spartan I, he was classified as a sufferer of this disorder. Now, considering the main method of infection for the Flood is by tapping into the spinal cord and essentially gaining control of the brain, the differences in genetic and neurological makeup in Johnson's brain made it significantly more difficult and time-consuming as well for an infection form to bother infecting him. The key fact here is that by no means do these alterations make Johnson anywhere close to being purely immune to the Flood. It just makes the Flood more likely to focus on, say, another human being, like poor old Jenkins over there, who just happens to have a typically developing genetic and neurological makeup. That, and Johnson is a badass, which makes him significantly harder to infect than your regular Marine. We can also assume that very similar rules apply to most of the other Spartan ones too, considering that many of them were later dispersed back into the general population of soldiers within the UNSC after the program was quietly shut down in 2506. Let's look at the Spartan IIs now, because the biological augmentations that Chief and Blue Team and the rest of the Spartan IIs went under differ quite significantly from the Spartan Is. In addition to many of the Orion augmentations, Spartan IIs also received strengthened bones, hormonal supplements, and most importantly, major alterations to their nervous system. Now, the reason the nervous system stuff is important is because the first thing an infection form does to kill and subdue a host is to tap into their spinal cord and destroy their nervous system. Now, this brings up a similar issue as before, in that the alterations make it a lot harder and a much longer procedure for the infection form to begin taking over a Spartan II, because they'll be far less familiar with their nervous system and their genetic makeup compared to, say, another human that has a typically developing nervous system, of which they easily know how to tap into and destroy and overtake. Again, by no means does this mean that it is impossible for a Spartan II to get infected. If a Spartan II was significantly overwhelmed by infection forms, chances are they might end up getting turned into a combat form, but they aren't priority one for the Flood because of how different infecting them is compared to the large majority of other humans. Not only do the infection forms have to penetrate these tiny patches of thick undersuit that's hidden behind the metal armor, they also have to get past the energy shields, which are essentially an infection form's arch nemesis. We know from the games and also the books that the energy in the shields tends to just pop them as soon as they come anywhere close to it, but you couple that with a smart AI, like Cortana, inside the Spartan, and the Flood are gonna have a bad time. There's a pretty cool section in the Flood, the novel, where an infection form actually manages to get its tendrils inside of Chief's neck, and is like this close to piercing his spinal cord, but right at the last minute, Cortana discharges the energy in his shields and kills it. It's a pretty handy combination of both an extremely high current shield and an incredibly intelligent extra set of hands inside your head. If the Flood do end up invading our galaxy at some point soon, then, I mean, as long as you've got an extremely expensive suit of armor and an extremely intelligent AI, then you really don't have that many problems.
Yeah,
the Spartan IIIs are a similar story too, but for now, we don't actually know how well they'd fare against the Flood for sure. For as much as we know, no Spartan III ever actually encountered the Flood. Now, this might be subject to change, this might change in the future, but for now, none of them did. However, if their augmentations are anything to go by, we can assume that they'd be equally as hard to infect as Spartan IIs. The combination of their significant biological and genetic alterations, combined with their lightning-fast reaction times and combat skill, would make them pretty hard for an infection form to even get close to, let alone actually grapple around their neck and try and infect them. One of their augmentations that could arguably make them even more resistant to infection than Spartan IIs is the H7556 UD61 drug, a drug which enhances their reaction times by up to 300%, creating a phenomenon known as Spartan time, where time seemingly slows down for them because they react so fast. This could be especially useful when being surrounded by loads of infection forms, and even though it is a trait in Spartan IIs, it is significantly enhanced in Spartan IIIs. So, we don't know truly how effective Spartan IIIs are against the Flood. What we do know for sure, though, is that they aren't immune. By any means, they are not immune. They're just significantly harder to infect. But what about the Spartan IVs, the new, more mainstream breed of Spartan? The augmentations in Spartan IVs provide fewer biological enhancements compared to the augmentations in the 2s and the 3s, but what they lack in biological benefits, they make up for in technological benefits, with their Gen 2 Mjolnir armor. This, combined with their lack of field experience against the Flood, means that it's quite hard to gauge whether they'd be more or less resistant to the Flood than Spartan 2s or 3s. I do think that given their significantly smaller biological alterations, they'd be more susceptible to it, and the Flood would be more likely to try and infect them than other Spartans. But depending on their armor, they'd probably have a harder time getting to them, given that the Gen 2 platform has like 3 billion different types of hyper-specialized armor that could be really, really effective during a Flood outbreak. Now, I did mention earlier that Spartan IVs don't exactly have any field experience against the Flood, and although that's still technically correct, there are many Spartan IVs who were previously soldiers, whether they be ODSTs or Marines, who likely encountered the Flood at some point during the war, so in hindsight they may actually already have experience in fighting them. For those who don't, there are wargame simulations like Halo 4's Flood and the co-op mode in Spartan Assault or Spartan Strike, one of the two, that were built specifically to train Spartan IVs should the Flood return. So in hindsight, Spartan IVs actually might have more experience overall fighting the Flood than Spartan IIIs, and even a majority of Spartan IIs, given how contained the Flood actually were in the grand scheme of things during the Human Covenant War. I might be wrong here, and this is just off the top of my head, but as far as I can remember, the only Spartan II to actually engage the Flood was Chief. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong there, but I think that's true. This means that the Spartan IVs would actually be pretty damn good against the Flood, should they return in the future, but nonetheless, like all the other Spartan classes, and all the other humans as well, they are far, far from immune. They're just a lot less likely to be infected than a regular human.
Yeah, I think that Spartan IVs would, I feel like, though, that, like, fighting the Flood in a simulation is far different than fighting them in real life, because especially, you know, for Chief and, you know, and the Arbiter and everybody who was like present during like that time of the war, they experienced it themselves. You know, it wasn't a simulation to where they kind of in the back of their minds, they were like, oh, if I die, I'm fine. If I die, I'm fine. They didn't have that in Halo 2 and 3 and 1, of course. The Spartan 4s, they had that in the back of their mind, I think. I really, really want the Flood to come back later on. I would love for the Flood to come back, because I love in the most recent game, I love that they brought back the Brutes. And I love the fact that they brought back like the Berserker Brutes, because they were like, you know, is like the one instance that comes to mind is like they like drop pod, and then like they like kick open the door, and then this one just like runs at you, and then if you have noise canceling headphones on and you crank it up all the way, and then it's suddenly, you know, like you have the sounds of like the music and like the gunfire and like the enemies and da 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 da, and then suddenly you hear boom, and then you hear a brute roaring and running footsteps and it getting closer to you. You don't see it yet. Like, I had that happen during my second playthrough and I absolutely loved it, but I would absolutely go insane if they brought the Flood back, because I absolutely loved them, even though they were a little bit of pain in the butt sometimes, especially the little bitty ones, especially in 2 and 3. They were really big pain in the butts, but I would absolutely love for the Flood to come back. I would love it. If they could somehow do it, I would absolutely love it. It'd be amazing. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, then be sure to smash the like button and be sure to comment down below. But if you guys think of this video, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss anything here at Spiggs Gaming. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye, everybody.